The year was 43 BC, and Rome trembled beneath the weight of its own ambitions. In the shadowed corridors of power, 3 men sat plotting the systematic elimination of their enemies, their fingers tracing names across parchment like death itself. Among those names, written in ink that might as well have been blood, stood Marcus Tullius Cicero. The greatest orator Rome had ever produced was about to discover that words, no matter how eloquent, could not shield flesh from steel. What followed was not merely an execution, but a calculated act of vengeance so brutal, so deliberately degrading that it would echo through the centuries as one of history's most chilling examples of political retribution. The man who had once commanded the attention of senators with his voice would soon find that same voice silenced in the most horrific way imaginable. His death would become a grotesque theatre of cruelty, orchestrated by enemies who understood that destroying a legend required more than simply ending a life. Today we strip away the sanitized accounts of textbooks and examine the unflinching reality of how Rome's most celebrated defender of liberty met his end. To understand the true horror of Cicero's final moments, we must first grasp the deadly game of power that led to his downfall. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March had torn Rome apart, leaving the Republic bleeding and desperate for direction. In this chaos, 2 titans emerged to battle for control of the Roman world. Marcus Tullius Cicero stood as the embodiment of republican virtue. Born without noble blood, he had clawed his way to prominence through pure intellectual brilliance. His speeches, arguments could destroy careers, and his philosophicals ignite the passions of crowds. His legal writings explored the very nature of justice and duty. To him, Caesar's death represented salvation. The dictator was gone, and perhaps the old republic could be restored. Mark Antony represented everything Cicero despised about Rome's new direction. A career soldier who had served as Caesar's closest lieutenant, Antony commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions and the affection of the common people. He was a man of action rather than contemplation, someone who believed that power flowed from the sword rather than the scroll. When Caesar fell, Antony emerged as the natural heir to his legacy. For a brief moment, these 2 giants attempted reconciliation. Antony made gestures toward the old republican traditions, even supporting legislation that would abolish the office of dictator forever. Perhaps, some hoped, the soldier and the scholar could work together to heal Rome's wounds. But this peace was built on quicksand. Their visions of Rome's future were fundamentally incompatible, and distrust began to poison every interaction between them. Cicero watched Antony's moves with growing alarm. Behind the general's diplomatic gestures, he detected the machinations of another would-be tyrant. Antony, meanwhile, saw Cicero as an aging academic living in the past, completely out of touch with the brutal realities of governing an empire. Each man embodied everything the other found contemptible about Roman politics. The breaking point came in the autumn of 44 BC, when Cicero's patience finally snapped. Standing before the Roman Senate, he unleashed the first of what would become 14 devastating speeches against Mark Antony. He called them the Philippics, deliberately echoing the ancient Greek orator who had warned his people about the threat of Macedonian tyranny. The title itself was an insult, casting Antony as a foreign despot threatening Roman liberty. These speeches were literary masterpieces designed for destruction. Cicero didn't merely attack Antony's policies, he systematically dismantled the man's entire character. He painted him as a drunken degenerate, a coward who had abandoned his duties, a corrupt politician who had sold his honor for gold. The second Philippic was so savage that Cicero never dared deliver it in person, instead publishing it for all of Rome to read. The attacks worked with devastating efficiency. Public opinion turned against Antony as the city, Senators' copies of the speeches spread throughout who had once supported the general began to distance themselves. The Roman people, swayed by Cicero's eloquence, started to view Antony as a threat to their freedoms. For a man whose reputation was his greatest political asset, this character assassination was more damaging than any military defeat. Humiliated and weakened, Antony found himself declared a public enemy by the very Senate he had once hoped to control. He was forced to flee Rome with his supporters, seeking refuge in the northern provinces, where he could rebuild his strength. For Cicero, this seemed like total victory. The defender of liberty had triumphed over the would-be tyrant through the power of words alone. But Cicero had made a fatal miscalculation. In his eagerness to destroy Antony, he had thrown his support behind another rising figure, Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian, Julius Caesar's 19-year-old adopted heir. The boy was ambitious and clearly talented, but Cicero believed he could control him. He saw Octavian as a useful weapon against Antony, someone who could be guided and then discarded once the Republic was restored. This proved to be one of the greatest political misjudgments in Roman history. Octavian was far more cunning than his youth suggested, and he had no intention of serving as anyone's puppet. While Cicero congratulated himself on out-Antony, he, maneuvering, failed to notice that he was being outmaneuvered in turn by a teenager who would soon become the first Roman emperor. The political landscape shifted with breathtaking speed. Military defeats and changing alliances transformed enemies into allies and allies into threats. By November of 43 BC, the impossible had happened. Antony, Octavian, and a third general named Lepidus met on a small island in a river to forge an alliance that would reshape the Roman world. They called themselves the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned dictatorship that gave them absolute power over the Republic. Their first order of business was eliminating their enemies and raising funds for the coming wars. To accomplish this, they revived one of Rome's most terrifying traditions, the proscription lists. These were death warrants posted in public places, containing the names of hundreds of senators and wealthy citizens who were to be hunted down and killed. Their property would be confiscated, and anyone who brought their heads to the triumvirs would be richly rewarded. It was during the negotiations for these lists that Antony finally saw his chance for revenge. Ancient historians tell us that for 2 days, Octavian resisted including Cicero's name among the condemned. The young man had once genuinely admired the great orator and understood his value to the state, but Antony was relentless in his demands. The humiliation of the Philippics still burned like acid in his memory, and he would not be satisfied until Cicero paid the ultimate price. Eventually, Octavian's resistance crumbled. Whether he was persuaded by Antony's arguments or simply decided that Cicero's death was an acceptable sacrifice for political unity, we will never know. What matters is that Marcus Tullius Cicero's name was added to the proscription lists, and it was placed at the very top by Antony's personal insistence. The hunt for Rome's greatest orator had begun, and Mark Antony intended to ensure that this hunt would end not with a quick death, but with a slow, public humiliation that would serve as a warning to anyone who dared challenge his authority again. When word reached Cicero that his name crowned the proscription lists, the man who had spent his life wielding words as weapons found himself confronted with a silence more terrifying than any he had ever known. The machinery of state-sanctioned murder was already grinding into motion, and across Rome, professional killers were studying the descriptions of their targets, calculating the bounties that would soon fill their purses with blood money. At 63 years old, Cicero was no longer the vigorous advocate who had once paced the courts of Rome with boundless energy. Age and the stress of political warfare had taken their toll on his body, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. He understood immediately what Antony's vengeance would entail. This would not be a clean death in battle or even a dignified execution. the general who had been humiliated by words intended to repay that humiliation in flesh. The old orator's first instinct was flight. From his villa near Tusculum, he began making desperate preparations to escape Italy entirely. His plan was to reach the coast and find passage to Macedonia, where Brutus and the other assassins of Caesar had established their stronghold. There, among the last defenders of the Republic, he might find sanctuary until the political winds shifted once again. But escape proved more elusive than Cicero had hoped. His brother Quintus, also condemned by the triumvirs, made the fatal decision to return to Rome to collect money for their journey. Within hours of entering the city, he was captured by Antony's agents. The soldiers showed no mercy to the elderly man, cutting him down in the streets like a common criminal. When news of his brother's death reached Cicero, it shattered whatever hope he might have harbored for successful flight. The journey south became a nightmare of false starts and mounting despair. Every road seemed to lead toward armed patrols. Every port brought reports of ships being searched and passengers questioned. Cicero's fame, once his greatest asset, had become a deadly liability. His face was known throughout Italy, and the promise of reward for his capture ensured that potential allies became potential betrayers. At one point, the exhausted orator managed to board a ship bound for Macedonia. For a few precious hours, it seemed as though he might escape Antony's reach. But the Mediterranean was rough that day, and Cicero, never a strong sailor, was overwhelmed by violent seasickness. The ship's captain, perhaps recognizing his passenger, or perhaps simply responding to his obvious distress, turned back toward the Italian coast. As they approached his coastal villa at Formiae, Cicero made a decision that would seal his fate. Instead of attempting another escape, he ordered his servants to carry him to the house where he had spent some of his happiest years. Whether this was resignation or simply the exhaustion of a man who had fought too many battles, we cannot know. What is certain is that Marcus Tullius Cicero had decided to await his executioners in the place where he had once found peace. The villa at Formiae had always been Cicero's refuge from the brutal world of Roman politics. Here, surrounded by his beloved books and the sound of waves breaking against the shore, he had composed some of his greatest works. The library contained scrolls representing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, from Greek philosophers to Roman historians. It was fitting, perhaps, that a man who had lived by words should choose to die among them. But even in this sanctuary, Cicero could not escape the reality of what was approaching. Reports reached him daily of other proscribed men being hunted down across Italy. Some had fought to the end, barricading themselves in their homes and selling their lives dearly. Others had tried to buy their freedom with gold, only to discover that Antony's agents were interested in heads, not coins. A few had chosen suicide rather than face the degradation of public execution. Cicero rejected all these options. He would neither flee nor fight nor take his own life. Instead, he spent his final days putting his affairs in order and writing letters to friends who had managed to escape the proscription lists. These letters, remarkable for their composure and dignity, reveal a man coming to terms with his mortality while maintaining his faith in the principles that had guided his entire career. The search parties were closing in with methodical precision. Antony had assigned the task to some of his most reliable officers, men who understood that failure would mean their own deaths. The centurion Herennius led the primary unit, accompanied by a military tribune named Popilius Laenas. The irony of Laenas's presence would have amused Cicero had he known of it. Years earlier, the great orator had successfully defended the tribune against charges of murder, saving his career and possibly his life. Now that same man was coming to kill his former advocate, drawn by the promise of gold and advancement in Antony's service. It was a perfect symbol of how completely the old bonds of Roman society had dissolved under the pressure of civil war. Gratitude, honor, and loyalty had all been sacrificed on the altar of political survival. The killers moved through the countryside like wolves following a scent trail. They questioned villagers, searched abandoned buildings, and followed every lead that might bring them closer to their prey. Local magistrates, terrified of being accused of harboring a prescribed man, provided whatever assistance they could. The entire machinery of Roman administration had been turned into an instrument of assassination. On December 7th, 43 BC, the hunters finally caught their quarry. Cicero's servants spotted the approaching soldiers while their master was being carried in a litter toward the coast, perhaps making one final attempt at escape, or perhaps simply seeking the comfort of familiar surroundings. The armed men moved with the confident stride of professionals who knew their business, their weapons already drawn, and their faces set with grim determination. Cicero's household slaves immediately prepared to defend their master. These men had served the orator for years, and many had been freed from bondage by his generosity. They were prepared to die rather than see him taken alive by in his final moments, refused to allow their Antony's assassins. But Cicero, even blood to be spilled for his sake. With the same dignity that had marked his entire career, he ordered them to stand aside and submit to what was inevitable. The litter was set down on the dusty road, and the old man leaned forward to face his killers. Contemporary accounts describe a figure who maintained his composure even as death approached. His hair was white, his face lined with age and worry, but his eyes remained clear and intelligent. This was still the man who had once held the Roman Senate spellbound with his eloquence, though now he would speak his final words to soldiers rather than senators. Herennius approached the litter with sword already drawn. The centurion had killed many men in his military career, but this execution was different. He was about to end the life of Rome's most famous orator, a man whose speeches had shaped the destiny of nations. Yet the soldier showed no hesitation, no recognition of the historical magnitude of what he was about to do. To him, Cicero was simply another name on the prescription list, another head to be collected for the bounty it would bring. What happened next would become one of the most documented moments in Roman history, recorded by multiple sources and debated by scholars for centuries to come. The manner of Cicero's death would reveal not only the depths of Antony's hatred, but also the complete transformation of Roman society from a republic governed by law to an empire ruled by fear. The details of those final moments have been preserved by multiple Roman historians, each adding layers to what became one of antiquity's most chilling accounts of political murder. Cicero, recognizing that resistance would only prolong his suffering and endanger his servants, made a choice that would define how history remembered him. He extended his neck toward Herennius, offering himself to the blade with the same stoic dignity he had displayed throughout his career. But the centurion was no skilled executioner. The first blow was clumsy and incomplete, opening a gaping wound without severing the head cleanly. Blood poured from Cicero's throat as he gasped and convulsed, his body refusing to surrender easily to death. Herennius struck again, and then a third time, each hack more desperate than the last. The man who had commanded audiences with his eloquent voice was reduced to choking on his own blood, his final sounds nothing more than wet, rattling gasps. When the head finally separated from the body, Herennius held it aloft like a trophy, blood still dripping from the severed neck. But Antony's instructions had been explicit and went far beyond simple murder. The general wanted to ensure that the instruments of his humiliation were completely destroyed. With methodical brutality, the soldiers hacked off both of Cicero's hands at the wrists. These were the hands that had penned the devastating Philippics, the fingers that had guided the stylus across parchment to create the words that had brought Antony to his knees before the Roman people. The symbolic mutilation was complete, but the true horror was yet to come. Ancient sources describe the soldiers wrapping the severed head and hands in cloth before beginning their journey back to Rome. The return trip became a grotesque parade of triumph, with Herennius and his menons stopping at Tavd way stations to display their trophies to curious onlookers. Word spread ahead of them that Cicero was dead, that the great orator had finally been silenced. When the killers finally reached Rome and presented themselves before Mark Antony in the Forum, the general's reaction exceeded even the expectations of those who knew his capacity for cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe Antony laughing with genuine joy as he examined the bloody remains of his tormentor. He handled Cicero's severed head like a curiosity, turning it this way and that, perhaps searching for some final trace of the arrogance that had once infuriated him so completely. The soldiers were rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. Herennius received enough gold to purchase a small estate, while his companions were granted promotions and bonuses that would secure their futures. But for Antony, the payment of bounties was merely a preliminary to the main event. He had planned something far more elaborate than a simple execution followed by burial. The man who had been humiliated in public would be degraded in death before the entire population of Rome. Orders were given for the construction of a special display at the rostra, the sacred speaking platform that stood at the heart of the Roman Forum. This curved marble structure had been the stage for centuries of political drama, the place where consuls announced victories, where senators debated matters of state, where orators like Cicero had swayed the emotions of crowds with their eloquence. Now it would become a monument to the death of free speech itself. The head and hands were nailed to wooden posts mounted on the platform, positioned so that every person entering the Forum would be forced to confront the gruesome spectacle. The nails were driven through the skull and palms with deliberate care, ensuring that the display would remain stable despite wind and weather. Cicero's lifeless eyes stared out over the space where he had once commanded the attention of Rome's greatest citizens, his mouth frozen open in a silent scream. The psychological impact on the Roman people was immediate and devastating. Citizens who had grown up hearing Cicero's voice ring out from that very platform now saw his head rotting in the Mediterranean sun, his flesh gradually turning black as decomposition set in. The message was unmistakable. This was the fate awaiting anyone who dared challenge the new order with words instead of swords. But the degradation was not yet complete. Fulvia, Antony's wife, had her own scores to settle with the dead orator. Cicero had mocked her in his speeches, painting her as a manipulative woman who controlled her husband through cunning rather than virtue. She had been married previously to Publius Clodius, one of Cicero's most bitter enemies, making her hatred of the orator both personal and political. When the severed head was brought before her in the privacy of Antony's house, Fulvia's reaction shocked even hardened soldiers who had witnessed countless atrocities. She spat repeatedly on Cicero's face, cursing him for the insults he had hurled at her family. Then, in a frenzy of vindictive rage, she grasped his lifeless tongue and pulled it from his mouth. This was the organ that had shaped his words, the instrument that had made him the most feared orator in Roman history. Using the sharp pins that held her elaborate hairstyle in place, Fulvia stabbed the tongue again and again, puncturing the flesh with dozens of tiny wounds. Her fury was so intense that she seemed to forget the presence of others, consumed by the need to inflict pain on the man who had wounded her pride. The soldiers watched in horrified fascination as the most powerful woman in Rome reduced herself to the level of a street savage, mutilating a corpse with implements designed for feminine beauty. This final act of vindictive cruelty became the detail that horrified contemporary observers more than any other aspect of Cicero's death. The image of a Roman matron defiling a severed tongue with hairpins spoke to the complete breakdown of civilized behavior that had accompanied the fall of the Republic. It suggested that the new order would be built not just on military strength, but on a fundamental rejection of the values that had once made Rome great. The display remained on the rostra for weeks, serving as both warning and entertainment for the masses. Vendors set up stalls nearby, selling food and drink to spectators who came to gawk at the remains of the famous orator. Children were brought by their parents to see what happened to enemies of the state. The decomposing flesh became a tourist attraction, drawing visitors from across Italy who wanted to witness the final humiliation of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Yet even as Antony celebrated his triumph, the seeds of his own destruction were already taking root. The alliance between the triumvirs was built on mutual necessity rather than genuine trust, and cracks were beginning to show in their partnership. Octavian, the youth whom Cicero had once thought to manipulate, was proving far more cunning than anyone had anticipated. He watched Antony's brutal excesses with calculating eyes, filing away each act of cruelty for future use. The systematic elimination of Rome's intellectual and political elite through the proscription lists had succeeded in silencing immediate opposition, but it had also created a climate of fear that made effective governance nearly impossible. Senators who survived did so by avoiding any action that might be interpreted as criticism. The vibrant debates that had once characterized Roman politics gave way to sullen acquiescence and whispered conversations in private homes. Trade and commerce suffered as wealthy merchants and landowners were murdered for their property, their businesses seized by the state or sold to political allies. The treasury, though temporarily enriched by confiscated wealth, was being drained by the massive military expenditures required to maintain control over the empire. The triumvirs had solved their immediate financial problems by looting their own citizens, but this was hardly a sustainable model for long-term prosperity. More ominously, the brutal methods used to eliminate domestic opposition were creating resentment throughout the provinces. Local aristocrats who had once cooperated with Roman rule began to question whether submission to such a regime was preferable to armed resistance. Reports reached Rome of unrest in Gaul, Spain, and the Eastern territories, as news of the proscriptions convinced provincial leaders that no Roman promise could be trusted. The rot was spreading outward from the capital, carried by merchants and soldiers who witnessed the transformation of Roman justice into Roman terror. The republic that had once inspired loyalty through its laws and institutions was being replaced by an empire that demanded obedience through fear alone. This fundamental change in the nature of Roman power would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate political crisis. Antony himself seemed oblivious to these longer-term implications, consumed as he was with the immediate satisfaction of revenge and conquest. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted. His enemies were dead, his authority was unquestioned, and his alliance with Octavian appeared to give him control over half the known world. The severed head on the rostra stood as permanent proof of his victory over those who had dared to challenge him with mere words. But history was preparing to deliver its own verdict on Mark Antony's methods, and that judgment would prove far harsher than anything Cicero had ever written in his speeches. The general who thought he had silenced his greatest critic forever was about to discover that some voices become louder in death than they ever were in life, and that the power of words can outlast even the sharpest sword. The brutal spectacle of Cicero's execution stands as one of history's most chilling reminders that power, when unchecked by law and conscience, inevitably devours those who dare speak truth to it. Mark Antony believed he had achieved the perfect revenge, silencing the voice that had humiliated him and displaying the mutilated remains as a warning to future generations. Yet in his moment of triumph, he had unknowingly authored his own condemnation. The words Cicero wrote survived the decay of his flesh, inspiring countless defenders of liberty across the centuries, while Antony's name became synonymous with the very tyranny the great orator had warned against.